America is awash in conversations about and calls for justice. Have you noticed that it is difficult to speak of justice for some issue without letting at least a hint of righteousness in one's tone? So that you and I are in the same conversation, let's look at the definitions of just from Merriam-Webster. Having a basis in or conforming to fact or reason. Conforming to a standard of correctness. Acting or being in conformity with what is morally upright or good. Being what is merited. Justice is defined as the maintenance or administration of what is just. I think most people use the word justice with an expectation that everyone will perfectly understand their basis. Further, people believe that their version of justice is, or should be, everyone's version. I think most people have the expectation that only variations in remedy are worthy of debate. This is nowhere more evident than politics. When we read what conservative thinkers say about justice, then read liberal thinkers, then progressive thinkers, then libertarian thinkers, we are left with our wits in a whirl. What we see is that the various musings are bent to privileging some position, and by extension, privileging some group, usually based on sex, color, class, religion, or some other trait. For most people, the leap from defending a position to demonizing a group is only visible out of the corner of their eye. It simply doesn't register that their position can be sexist, racist, ageist, etc. People tend to stop thinking of the consequences of holding their position the moment they are convinced their position is the correct one. Tightly bound to justice is the concept of fairness. Both justice and fairness are abstractions. The rules governing each are arbitrary and sometimes capricious. If we broadly agree on a standard, we can use it to roughly mark what is just. Agreement, though, is hard to achieve. Context and details muddy that water. Fairness is much more difficult to nail down, though. It is very often a much more personal concept than is justice. So let's talk about fairness. When you were young, were you ever told that there's no such thing as fair, or the world isn't fair? When I was first told this, my reaction was, that's not fair. When youngsters use the word fair, they generally mean I didn't get what I want or deserve. Even if the prize is split evenly for two children, one or the other might say it isn't fair, and then start a string of justifying statements like, my piece should be bigger because I'm older, or I want more because Billy doesn't even like chocolate cake. It seems even when adults in the U.S. talk about fair and equal treatment, they rarely mean the equal part. Equal opportunity, for instance, is rarely equal. American rugged individualism generates statements like, everyone has an equal chance at X. Except that the prerequisites for getting a shot at X favor one group over others. Even for adults, fairness seems based on an individual believing they are more deserving of the bigger piece. The delivery of justice and fairness rarely maps exactly to what we actually want when we say we want justice or fairness. We shine the prettiest lights on our wants, and the concepts simply are not fixed or irrefutably objective. For instance, if justice has been served in a court of law, but one side doesn't agree with the court-ordered remedy, the wanting justice emotional position has not been satisfied. In this case, one or both sides might code switch and start demanding fairness rather than justice. By definition, justice has been served, and one or the other or both sides might be left feeling there was a miscarriage of justice. America has thousands of legal rules about who can and cannot deliver justice. There are, though, a lot more rules in the social sphere. We go about punishing people for their slights all the time. We judge and condemn individuals in our families, groups, communities simply for being too different. Sometimes a person is shunned for their social transgression. No community is immune from this, and sometimes a social remedy crosses the legality line such that enforcing the remedy breaks a criminal law, even if the original transgression did not. I'd give examples here, but if you can't immediately think of some, you probably haven't heard anything I've said so far. How often is the word justice used as a nobler sounding alternative to revenge or retaliation? How these concepts play out in rhetoric and action depends strongly on the context. Retaliation, for instance, might be called a proportional response when one nation-state uses violence to balance the power and aggression scales. Or both parties might insist on a just and fair agreement when negotiating a contract. But at the end of the negotiation, the phrase, "best we could get," is often heard. And that has the overly ripe smell of, it's not fair enough. Even when alternative, equitable solutions exist, the party who feels they are in the weakest position will have a great deal of trouble seeing the value in the alternative, maybe even rejecting it out of hand because it might be a trick. Sometimes individuals will fall prey to some version of a get-rich-quick scheme. These schemes are nothing more than attempts to sell a customer more power or status. In business, multi-level marketing is the most obvious poster child. Though if you examine most advertising, you will see that the product is second to the implied promise of status. In religion, Prosperity Ministries gets the Oscar. The promise of a great reward for a little investment is really a promise of future power and status. MLMs promise power through increased wealth. The ministries are about gaining a privileged position, salvation after death. We are at our most gullible when the carrot hanging off the stick is power or status. Being human, most people will follow that carrot off a metaphorical cliff. In the U.S., we have an ongoing schoolyard brawl over economic fairness. It is said those who amass wealth earned it. If I'd scraped together a few $1,000s, bought Apple stock in their serious crisis period, and kept it all these years, I would certainly be wealthier today. Exactly how would I have earned it? What value did I create that called for such return? At best, that would simply be like winning the lottery. A lucky turn of events, for sure, just not earned. This kind of wealth gathering is sometimes justified with statements like, "Those who take the biggest risks deserve the biggest reward." I've noticed that the people who say this, or something like this, are usually the people who have had the biggest returns. Those who lost on a big risk will probably have some good "it's not fair" reasons at the ready. Consider the situation with a casino owner and a casino patron. Talk about the mathematical odds until you're blue in the face. If the patron feels lucky, they will have arrived in a car but will go home in a bus because their luck was about to change. Some employees of publicly traded companies get bonuses in the form of stock options. At some future date, they are allowed to buy the stated quantity of stock at the original optioned price rather than the current market value. If the market value went up significantly and they held on to the stock until retirement, they would have had stock worth several $1,000,000. Is it fair that someone should get that much more than their wages simply for working for the right company? Is it more just or less just if that company had a glass ceiling or other hiring promotion practices that favored one group, usually European descended men, over others? From there, a fairness remedy was created politically. It was called affirmative action, and it immediately engendered the counterclaim of reverse discrimination. The pro side argued that it was a fair but inadequate first step in addressing long-standing social inequities. The other side argued that everything should be based only on merit. When the rules for deciding merit are mostly or entirely arbitrary, there can be no reasonable equality. For instance, before around 1975, for in hindsight entirely capricious reasons, it was very, very difficult for a woman to get into any law school. We have no idea how well the women who didn't get in would have fulfilled the duties of an attorney, but they certainly would not have been worse than the men who got those slots over them simply because they were men. For every societal issue that will upset the status quo, one side or the other is going to start shouting, "Not fair," attempting to justify their position to maintain or overthrow the existing power and status balance. It is very difficult to bring about true equal opportunity. The favored group does not want to lose the favored position and strives to create rational-sounding justifications. This happens in many areas of life. Men don't want to lose power to women. Straights don't want to lose status to gays. Whites don't want to lose status to blacks. Wealth doesn't want progressive taxation. On and on and on. Those in positions of power and high status find creative ways to scream, "It's not fair." It is the current version of feudalism. Some groups operate on the belief that they have power and status even when they don't. People with belief in their own power and status are totally convinced that they deserve what they have, and many of them are also convinced the lower classes deserve what they have and what they get too. Just what parts of the brain are determining the nature of justice? Revenge and vengeance are two of the dozens of emotional drivers pushing us to advocate for justice and fairness. The level of emotional or physical violence expressed as a response to an event does not depend on the actual event, but rather on how one feels about the event. Just how much power, status, wealth, etc. is on the table to be lost or gained. As an example, the debates about same-sex marriage had one side asking for legal equality, that is, simply asking for the protection of civil marriage. The other side sometimes argued that their heteronormative marriage would be diminished if gays were allowed to marry. That really meant that they would lose a privileged place. Nothing changed for the straight couple, except that their status ladder became shorter by losing a rung or two below them, such that they seemed lower overall. When the laws were overturned and mixed-race couples could marry, the heteronormatives cried foul for the same motive with different reasons. Human beings easily change the tactics used to gain or retain advantage based on circumstances. However, we only begrudgingly expand the possible options to fulfill our wants. We simply aren't willingly, rationally, culturally strategic. We fixate on a single remedy and simply refuse to consider alternative ways to achieve fulfillment and satisfaction in life. Look what we've done in the name of justice in the U.S. We have 3 strikes laws, mandatory prison sentences that allow no consideration of circumstances. We have people fighting against a woman's bodily autonomy or same-sex marriage. We try to limit people's gender identity to the sex on their birth certificate and 100 other issues. And none of that is based on anything but how people feel about the concepts. And those feelings on both sides are entirely arbitrary. Get enough agreement for your position and you have a movement, or even a political party. All the arguments will carry some trappings of justice and fairness, and arguments from all sides of these issues will be filled with tu quoque fallacies. Both sides trying to justify why they are sure their side should carry the day and the other side is hypocritical. Being a hypocrite, by the way, is generally considered low status. One side trying to gain a greater measure of power or status and the other trying not to lose power or status. Often the standard by which we measure justice is based on morality. The problem with that is simply that we don't have strong agreement on that either. It's very fuzzy, yet groups of people will argue that their moral system is absolute, even while they practice relative morality based very loosely on their defended absolute morality. For instance, most Christians believe it is okay to sometimes kill. The convoluted justifications some Christians have for supporting the death penalty are breathtaking. What America does in the criminal justice system is practice retributive justice, where punishment is meted out to fit the crime, usually allowing for some variation of fitness because of reasons. Funny how the punishment for any given crime seems harsher for the defendant who is a member of a low power and status group. Possession of the more expensive powder cocaine is not punished as harshly as the possession of the same amount of the cheaper version called crack. Guess which socioeconomic class uses which version? Fairness favors the higher status individuals, and victim blaming becomes the privileged language of fairness. The grand prize for victim blaming is the classic, "She shouldn't have been dressed like that." High status has reasons, low status has excuses. A person's perceived status is enough to earn them a pass or a bullet in our criminal justice system, guilty of a crime or not. As long as we, knowingly or not, insist on a class system, shifting from retributive justice to restorative justice will be mostly impossible. As a society, we are far more interested in punishing the transgressor than restoring damages. I find it telling that human beings can continually justify repeated communal and individual brutal conduct with lofty words connoting justice and fairness. We really do not want to be responsible for our ape ancestry. As soon as we start digging the ground out from under the feet of power and status, the strong backlash begins. The cries of justice and fairness will ring from all sides, while any chance of a common understanding of justice or fairness gets lost in the weeds. So, notice yourself. Notice where you are calling for some form of justice and fairness. Find your motivations and justifications. Examine what is at stake and who gains and who loses. Draw your lines in the sand rather than stone. Then negotiate with the people who drew different lines. Maybe an equitable solution can be found. Maybe not. Either way, it is better than starting the conversation by screaming some version of "it's not fair" at each other. We have enough of that already.